Apparently, word got out that they were moving me up to the big leagues this morning because it's an empty congregation this morning. Hope everyone's doing good and staying safe through this unprecedented time we're going through now. If you would turn with me to the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes. This is one of my favorite books in the Old Testament. Really, I guess just depending on the season I'm going through in life. But usually it rotates around between Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. Pick up with me in chapter 1, verse 1. In the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. What advantage does a man have in all his work which he does under the sun? Another translation puts it, meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. It's kind of a doom and gloom way of looking at life. I want to share some thoughts I picked up from a recent Bible study, or recent Bible project study that I had, and help us to maybe gain a greater understanding of the book of Ecclesiastes, as well as to summarize it up for us. The book is essentially trying to tear down everything we thought life was about to help the good news shine through as the good news. For those of you that studied Ecclesiastes before, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I think I'm humbled a little more each time I just read through it or even dig deep into a study of it. For instance, how many of you know your great-great-grandpa's full name? It's kind of mind-boggling to me to think that my great-great-grandkids won't even know that I existed on earth, most likely. I know for me, the longer I live, the harder it is for me to fight contentment in my Christian life. I think that I like Ecclesiastes so much because it puts life into perspective for me, and whatever contentment I do have, it pulls the carpet from under my feet. I think we've all been at a point in our life to where maybe we've asked ourselves, is the life of Christ worth it? Maybe you've asked yourself, are my prayers being answered? Is it worth me taking the time to pray? Or maybe you thought to yourself, I thought once I became a Christian, life was going to get a lot easier, but actually it's gotten a lot harder for me. And maybe you're even going through that season in your life right now. I think Ecclesiastes is a great book for us to go into and regain confidence. The way Ecclesiastes is written, it takes us through the journey of one of the wisest and richest men of his time, thought to be Solomon. And it's written from the standpoint of, okay, for the sake of the argument, if we had just the 80, 90, 100 years that we have here on earth, would there be any meaning to life? We'll get back into this a little later. But let's get back into chapter 1. The word vanity here is one of those church words that maybe you wouldn't normally use at work or with your friends. It's one of those words maybe like fellowship or congregate. If you ever want to look up a word like this that maybe you're not familiar with and want to know what the original word was in the original text that was written, the best way to do that is go to Strong's Concordance and look up what the word means. If you've ever looked up the word vanity in this context, it actually is the Hebrew's word hebel, and that is defined as a vapor or breath. And with that definition, it may ring a bell to you to the passage of James chapter 4, where it says that life is but a vapor, appears for a little while, and then it vanishes. I believe this is a perfect way for us to look at the word here. Life isn't meaningless or in vain. In fact, in Ecclesiastes chapter 11:8, it says, indeed, if a man should live many years, let him rejoice in them all. But rather, life is but a vapor. Life is here, and then it's gone. And that becomes a more realistic truth for us with each passing generation before us. Also, it can be in a vapor in the sense of the way it's used in chapter 8, verse 14. Chapter 8, verse 14, it says, this is futility which is done on earth, that is, there are righteous men to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked. On the other hand, there are evil men to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I say this too is futility. The word is translated here to futility, but it's the same Hebrew word, hebel. If you think of water vapor maybe coming from a pot, is it real? Of course it's real. We can see it coming up here, but as soon as you try to grasp it or lay hold of it, it's gone. And isn't kind of the meaning of life like that as well? You think you finally got life figured out, and then you don't. In fact, the best way to know you don't have life figured out is that you think you have life figured out. Sometimes we think we finally have got it figured out, and then something comes along and rocks our whole view of what we may think justice is or what the meaning to life is all about. The preacher here says that life isn't saying that life is meaningless. Rather, he just can't grasp the meaning with all the goods, bads, and uglies that come through his lifetime. There are some good things that happen to us while on earth. As we'll see earlier, or see later, like having a great meal, or having maybe a spouse, or having kids. But there also are going to be serious events that's going to come along in our life and challenge the views that we have on life. So what's going to come our way? We have no way of predicting, or we're going to have good come, bad come. The writer's going to take us on a journey to find out, and then at the conclusion, give us what the true meaning to life is all about. So let's continue on in chapter 1, read verses 4 through 7. A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Also, the sun rises and the sun sets, and hastening to its place, it rises again, blowing toward the south, then turning toward the north. The wind continues swirling along, and on its circular courses the wind returns. And all the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers flow, they flow again. That's something that's kind of hard to grasp with logic if you think about it. If I fill a bucket with water, what happens? The bucket fills up and then it overflows. Yet every single day, the rivers run into the sea, it rains, but the oceans never rise. Here's a good one in verse 10. Is there anything of which one might say, "See, this is new"? It has already existed for ages, which were before us. Whenever I was reading this, I was thinking, what about a smartphone? I don't think they had smartphones back in the days when Ecclesiastes was written. There's a guy by the name of Marshall McLuhan. He actually predicted the internet 30 years before it was invented. And he had a very interesting theory about technology. The theory essentially says all that technology does is takes our body and creates shiny new extensions of them. So for instance, with a smartphone, all the smartphone is an extension of our ear, our mouth, and maybe our to-do list. And it just helps us to do those things better, at least in theory, because most of the time we're multitasking while doing them. But really, if you think about it, we've talked to each other for ages before that and listened to each other before that and long before they were here. Verses 16 through 18. I said to myself, "Behold, I have magnified and increased in wisdom more than all who are over Jerusalem before me. My mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge, and I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. And I realize that this is also striving after wind. Because in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain." In other words, ignorance is bliss. Have you ever had to study physics in school? So with this, let's take for an example this podium here. The podium appears to be solid and if you had to lift it, is extremely heavy. But if you were to study into physics, in actuality, what appears to us here to be solid is actually composed of molecules, which are in turn composed of little atoms, and those are composed of little things called protons and neutrons. And in physics, you learn that an atom is actually mostly empty space. And before you realize it, you almost come to the conclusion that this podium is actually more not here than it is here. In much wisdom is much grief. So the teacher brings us to the truths that may make us uncomfortable or make us question what we thought life was all about. But the purpose of this is to open our mind to help us lead us to God, as the writer does at the end of the book. There, he finally reveals to us that the 80, 90 years we have here on earth isn't all we have. But in fact, not only is there more to life, but every decision we make here on earth does matter, and it may not matter in a way that we may never see the fruits of while we're here on earth. There may be hardships or events in our life that we may never understand, or things that may happen that we may never be able to grasp, but that doesn't mean that God isn't here with us through them. So with this, maybe a lesson I would like to take away is for us to think of our life as we're playing a part in God's story. We have the privilege to carry out God's good news while we're here on earth and to go throughout the world and preach the gospel, and maybe avoid thinking that God's supposed to play a part in our story. Because when that happens, if something doesn't go the way we want it to, we get mad, and then we tend to sometimes try to blame God for that, and then that leads down a whole rabbit hole. So let's switch gears from there and look at the goods of life. Go to chapter 2, verses 24 through 25. There is nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen, that is from the hand of God. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? So here we go from life as vanity to the preacher saying that it's good to enjoy a meal and reflect back on your work because of the fact that God is the main reason we have them. How often do we get caught up in worrying about our work and it ends up stressing us out to the max? I know I've been guilty of this. Another way of saying this verse is to take time to enjoy the fruits of your labor, to sit back and smell the roses occasionally. This thought goes into chapter 3, verses 9 through 14. What profit is there to a worker from that which he toils? I have seen the task of God has given the sons of men which to occupy themselves. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity to their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning to the end. I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is a gift from God. I know that everything God does will remain forever. There is nothing to add to it. There is nothing to take from it. For God has so worked that men should fear him. So here we see also that we're supposed to enjoy doing good and to enjoy a meal. And to drop down to verse 20 through 22. All go to the same place, all come from the dust, and all return to the dust. Who knows that the breath of man ascends upward and the breath of the beast descends downward to the earth? I have seen nothing better than that man should be happy in his activities, for this is his lot. For who can bring him to see that which recurs after him? So it concludes here that there is nothing better on earth than to be happy in our activities. Over to chapter 5, verse 15 through 16. As he had come naked from his mother's womb, so he shall return. He will take nothing from the fruit of his labor that he can carry in his hand. This also is a grievous evil. Exactly as a man is born, thus he will die. So what advantage is it to him who toils after the wind? So we see here, it says that we come into the world naked and we leave the same. You know, in verse 16, it says, you think about it, we spend our whole lives working, and for what? To leave the earth one day with exactly what we came into it with. In verse 18, it says, "Here is what I've seen to be good and fitting, to eat, to drink, and enjoy oneself in all one's labor, in that which he toils under the sun during the few years of life which God has given him. For this is his reward." So we circle back here to the same thought as earlier, enjoying the fruits of our labor, for it is good and fitting. Over to chapter 9, verse 7. "Go then, eat your bread in happiness, and drink your wine with cheerful heart, for God already approved your works." So we see there that God approves for us to slow down and take time to enjoy life from time to time. In verse 8, "Let your clothes be white all the time. Let not oil be lacking from your head." So it even shows here that we're actually supposed to look like we're enjoying life. Chapter 11, verses 8 through 10. "Indeed, if a man should live many years, let him rejoice in them all, and let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. Everything that has to come will be futility. Rejoice, young man, during your childhood, and let your heart be pleasant during the days of young manhood. And follow the impulses of your heart and desires of your eyes. Yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all these things. So remove grief, anger from your heart, and put away the pain from your body, because childhood and prime of your life are fleeting." So back in verse 8, we see that we are to enjoy life, but remember, it'll be gone before we know it, and there are going to be hard times to come for all of us. And they're going to come maybe even in an instant, and when you least expect them to. Verse 9, "To enjoy the days of your youth, but enjoy them in the fear of the Lord." So that means to enjoy them responsibly and honoring God through them. So you see through this the recurring theme of the book, that we're all going to die. Life is but a vapor. It's short, and sometimes life is even hard to grasp. But enjoy it while you have it, to sit back and to enjoy a meal with a brother or sister. Now, we're all guilty of thinking life sometimes has to be one way or the other. Like either life is all doom and gloom, or that life has to be good all the time. But the preacher through Ecclesiastes points out to us that life's actually a combination of the both. When I think of how to sum it up, I can't think but to think of a verse of a Jimmy Buffett song, "He Went to Paris." If you hang around Ralph long enough, you'll learn to love Jimmy Buffett. Shout out to Ralph if you're watching. So, in the song, the man at the end of the song uses a great one-liner to wrap up when reflecting back on his life. He says, "Some of it's magic, some of it's tragic, but I've had a good life all the way." So let's wrap it up with this. Why did the writer choose eating and drinking as illustration for the meaning of joy? What's the most common thing throughout the Bible to describe God's people of what we're made for and what we're doing in fellowship? It's usually eating or feasting. Have you ever thought about what we're acknowledging every time we open our mouth to eat? We're acknowledging our dependence on something outside of ourselves. You know, did you grow all the food that you eat? So when we sit down and eat a meal, we can enjoy it while also realizing how blessed we are by God to be given life each day and to be satisfied in the reality that I'm not responsible for my joy, but rather God is responsible for all the joy in my life. And that is a chance we have to reflect each time we sit down, and it forward points to the conclusion of the book, where the writer writes in chapter 12, verse 13, to fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. If you have any needs, if you would, please contact the church. We'll be happy to help in any way we can.